Gassimo had wandered away from where I stood. He began screaming from another side of the village. We ran to where he was. More than 20 people lay face down on the earth. They were all lined up, and blood still poured into their bullet wounds. A stream of it had begun running along the ground, making its way under each body as if joining them together. Gassimo's sobs grew louder as he turned each body over. Some of their mouths and eyes were open in shapes that showed how much they had cringed as they waited for the bullets from behind. Some had inhaled dirt, perhaps while taking their last breath. The bodies were mostly men in their late and early 20s. A few were younger. On other parts of the path of the village were the half-burnt remains of those who had fought fiercely to free themselves, only to die outside. They lay on the ground in different postures of pain, some reaching for their heads. The white bones of their jaws visible, others curled up like a child in a womb, frozen. The fire had begun to die down, and I was running around the village looking for something I did not want to see. I hesitantly tried to make out the faces of burnt bodies, but it was impossible to tell who they had been. Besides, there were too many of them. They stayed in that house, Gassimo said to me as he pointed towards one of the charred houses. The fire had consumed all the door and window frames, and the mud that had been pushed in between the sticks was falling off, revealing the ropes through which the remaining fire was making its way. My entire body went into shock. Only my eyes moved, slowly opening and closing. I tried to shake my legs to get the blood flowing, but I fell to the ground, holding my face. On the ground, I felt as if my eyes were growing too big for their sockets. I could feel them expanding, and the pain released my body from the shock. I ran toward the house. Without any fear, I went inside and looked around the smoke-filled rooms. The floors were filled with heaps of ashes. No solid form of a body was inside. I screamed at the top of my lungs and began to cry as loudly as I could, punching and kicking with all of my might into the weak walls that continued to burn. I had lost my sense of touch. My hands and feet punched and kicked the burning walls, but I couldn't feel a thing. Gassimo and the rest of the boys began pulling me away from the house. I kept kicking and punching as they dragged me out. I've looked everywhere around for them, but I can't see them anywhere, Gassimo said. I was sitting on the ground with my legs spread in the dirt, holding my head in my hands. I was filled up with anger. I hissed and boiled, and my heart felt as if it was going to explode. At the same time, I felt as if something had literally been placed on my head, heavier than I could ever imagine, and my neck was beginning to ache. If we hadn't stopped to rest on that hill, if we hadn't run into Gassimo, I would have seen my family, I thought. My head was burning as if on fire. I put my hands on both my ears and squeezed them in vain. I didn't know what was happening to me. I got up, walked behind Bassimo, and locked his neck under my arms. I squeezed him as hard as I could. I can't breathe, he said, fighting back. He pushed me off, and I fell next to a pestle. I picked it up and hit Gassimo with it. He fell, and when he got up, his nose was bleeding. My friends held me back. Gassimo looked at me and said sadly, I didn't know this was going to happen. He walked toward a mango tree and sat by it, wiping the blood falling from his nose. My friends had pinned me to the ground and were vehemently arguing. Some said it was Gassimo's fault that we didn't get to see our parents. Others said it wasn't, and then if it hadn't been for him, we would all be dead. I didn't care. I wanted to see my family, even if it meant dying with them. My friends started fighting amongst themselves, kicking and punching, throwing each other to the ground. Al-Haji punched Juma into one of the houses and his pants caught fire. He screamed as he rolled on the dirt, slapping the fire off. When Juma got up, he picked up a stone and threw it at Al-Haji. It hit Al-Haji in the back of his head. Blood ran down his neck. When Al-Haji saw his blood, he became furious and ran toward Juma, but Gassimo intervened. He pulled Al-Haji away and tied his bleeding head with a piece of cloth. We were all quiet and angry in the ruins of the village, where it seemed our journey had ended. None of this is anyone's fault, Gassimo said slowly. His words made me angry, and I wanted to rush him again. But we heard loud voices of people approaching the village. We ran into the nearby coffee farm and lay in the dirt watching the village. A group of more than 10 rebels walked into the village. They were laughing and giving each other high fives. 2 looked slightly older than me. They had blood on their clothes, and one of them carried the head of a man which he held by the hair. The head looked as if it was still hanging, feeling its hair being pulled. The blood dripped from where the neck had once been. The other rebel carried a gallon of gasoline and a big box of matches. The rebel sat on the ground and started playing cards, smoking marijuana, and boasting about what they had done that day. We burned 3 villages today. One skinny guy, who was perhaps enjoying himself more than everyone else, laughed. Another rebel, the one only dressed in full army gear, agreed with him. Yes, 3 is impressive in just a few hours in the afternoon. He paused, playing with the side of his G3 weapon. I especially enjoyed burning this village. We caught everyone here. No one escaped. That is how good it was. We carried out the command and executed everyone. Commander will be pleased when he gets here." He nodded, looking at the rest of the rebels, who had stopped the game to listen to him. They all agreed with him, nodding their heads. They gave each other high fives and resumed their game. "Some people escaped in the other two villages," the other rebel, who was standing up, said. He paused, rubbing his forehead as if pondering why that had happened, and then continued, "They probably saw the smoke from this village and knew something was happening. We should change our strategy. Next time, we must attack all the villages at the same time." The others didn't pay him as much attention as they did when the rebel, dressed in the army suit, spoke. The rebels went on with their card games, chatting for hours, and then, for no apparent reason, they shot a couple of rounds into the air. Someone in my group moved, and the dried coffee leaves made some noise. The rebels stopped playing their game and ran in different directions to take cover. Two started walking toward us, aiming their guns. They walked fast and then crouched. As if planned, they all got up and started running. Bullets followed us out of the coffee farm. As if planned, we all got up and started running. Bullets followed us out of the coffee farm and into the forest. Gassimo was in front, and he knew where he was going. We all followed him. When we reached the forest edge, Gassimo stopped and waited for us to catch up. "Follow the path straight," he told us. When I reached him, he tried to smile at me. I don't know why, but it made me angrier. I ran past him and followed the narrow path in which the grass had grown. I was behind ALWG, who parted the bushes like a diver heading to the surface for air. Some of the bushes slapped me, but I didn't stop. The gunshots grew louder behind us. We ran for hours, deeper into the forest. The path had ended, but we kept running until the sky swallowed the sun and gave birth to the moon. The bullets continued to fly behind us, but now their redness could be seen as they pierced through the bushes. The moon disappeared and took the stars with it, making the sky weep. Its tears saved us from the red bullets. We spent the night heavily breathing under bushes soaked with rain. The hunters had given up. Gassimo began to cry like a child. It always made me afraid of when such things happened. In my younger years, I had learned that grown men cry only when they have no other choice. Gassimo rolled on the ground in pain. When we finally summoned the courage to pick him up, we found out why he was crying. He had been shot some time as we ran in the previous night. His right leg was bleeding and it had begun to swell. He was holding his side and didn't want to remove his hand. ALWG lifted Gassimo's hand, and the side was bleeding as well. It was as if his hand had been holding his blood from flowing. It rushed out of him like water breaking banks. He began to sweat. ALWG asked me to contain the blood by placing my hand on Gassimo's side. I did, but his blood continued to slip through my fingers. He looked at me, his eyes sadly beginning to sink deeper into their sockets. He managed to raise his weak right hand to hold the wrist of my hand that was on his side. He had stopped sobbing, even though tears still ran down his eyes, but not as much as the blood that he was losing. Musa couldn't bear the sight of blood any longer. He fainted. ALWG and I took Gassimo's shirt off and tied it around his side to contain his blood. The rest of our companions watched with tense faces. Musa woke up and joined them. In between Gassimo's gasps, he told us that there was a wali, a place outside the village where people processed coffee and other crops nearby. And if we went back to the farm, he would show us how to rejoin the path and get to it. We had taken the wrong turn somewhere during the night. Gassimo put his arms around my shoulder and ALWG's. We lifted him and began walking slowly through the bushes. We set him down every few minutes, and he wiped his sweaty forehead. It was past midday when Gassimo began heaving, his entire body shaking. He asked us to set him down. He held his stomach and began to roll in pain from one side to the other. His heaving increased, and he stopped rolling. He lay flat on his back, staring at the sky. His eyes were fixed on something, and his legs vibrated and stopped. His hands did the same, then finally his fingers, but his eyes remained open, transfixed at the top of the forest. "Let's pick him up." ALWG's voice was shaking. I put Gassimo's arm around my neck. ALWG did the same, and we walked with him, his feet dragging on the ground. His arms were cold. His body was still sweating, and he continued bleeding. We didn't say a word to each other. We all knew what had happened. When we got to the wali, the place where people can process coffee or other crops, Gassimo's eyes were still open. ALWG closed them. I sat by him. His blood was on my palm and on my wrist. I regretted hitting him with the pestle. The dry blood was still in his nose. I began to cry softly. I couldn't cry as much as I wanted to. The sun was getting ready to leave the sky. It had come out to take Gassimo with it. I just sat by him, unable to think. My face began to harden. When the breeze blew against it, I felt how my flesh resisted the cool wind. All through the night, no sleep came to me. My eyes watered and dried over and over again. I did not know what to say. For a few minutes I tried to imagine what it felt like for Gassimo when his fingers vibrated to let the last air out of his body.